John Hopkins, George Washington, Michigan State, University of Tulsa,
Western Ontario.
Yeah, like there are educational institutions from all over the world. They decided to do this, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of things, all right? Because the big things that I've noticed, the counterpoints, is intelligence doesn't exist,
Which is nonsense.
race doesn't exist,
Also nonsense.
the tests are culturally biased.
Yes.
And these are some of the major points, right? So they talk about, the meaning and measurement of intelligence, from this piece that was put in 1994 in the Wall Street Journal. It's written, intelligence is a very general mental capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. It's not merely book learning, a narrow academic skill, or test-taking smarts. Rather, it reflects a broader and deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings, catching on, making sense of things, or figuring out what to do. Intelligence, so defined, can be measured, and intelligence tests measure it well. They're among the most accurate, in technical terms, reliable and valid, of all psychological tests and assessments. They do not measure creativity, character, personality, or other important differences among individuals, nor are they intended to. So, a debate that also arose from this information, and you see I think it was during the mid to late 90s, you saw this become more prevalent. The idea of emotional intelligence.
Correct.
Right? Your EQ, your emotional quotient.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing about emotional intelligence. At the time of the book that was written, called Emotional Intelligence, I forget what the subtitle was, there was not one piece of empirical data to support any of the author's assertions.
Yep.
It was a purely theoretical, speculative work of
Pseudoscience?
editorial, pseudoscience, certainly. 10 years after, it was revisited and found that if you look at the work performance of people according to their EQ scores, it had absolutely no correlation to achievement and success in a workplace. So EQ, for all intents and purposes, is bullshit. Useless. Absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
So intelligence is where it's at. And, there's a certain type of people who argue that intelligence is irrelevant. These are unintelligent people.
Yes, 100%.
Right? So now, talking about intelligence. Now, you and I both we're not going to go over our scores.
Understood. Oh, Jules Winfield.
Pulp
Fiction.
Said
That was the quote, yeah.
Nice. So, that's the way Pat's brains works.
Yes.
So,
it felt relative to you mentioning us taking IQ tests. So I couldn't help but say that.
So we both took this test.
Yeah.
And we took the Raven test.
The Raven test, correct.
Right? And that didn't have any words on it.
Not a single
word.
Have
now, there's a gentleman by the name of Philip Rushton who was just absolutely crucified. He was a psychologist who would go around on these speaking tours. Very, very prolific writer. And he was the guy who had all this information and basically was the champion of this movement academically up until he passed away, I think 2 years ago from cancer. But he would have these debates. He would be heckled. He would be mocked. He would have to, travel with security. It was just disgusting. But one of the things he would cite, and I recall this in one of his presentations, he was talking about IQ tests that he got a grant for and would administer to Africans in Africa. And he would say, so many people say that there was an inherent bias in the test, and that, the Africans were just, wouldn't do well because whites were administering the tests. And he said, no, we got all local people to administer the tests.
Yeah.
And the tests were the Raven tests. And I believe that's its name. It might have a more technical name, but Raven test is what it's known as.
Yeah.
There are no words.
There are no words.
There are no words. It's all abstract puzzle solving and problem solving.
Patterns
and it's a 40-minute test.
Correct.
60 questions. And you and I both did it. And there was no cultural bias. There was no anything.
No.
It's either you could figure it out or you can't.
Yeah. And the symbols weren't anything of any sort of reference to something else.
Right. It was just abstract, like
complete abstract patterns.
Right. Everything looked like a kaleidoscope, right?
Yeah,
like
it was really cool.
And just being able to recognize patterns. And Philip Rushton was showing this test and saying this is the test that they were given.
Yeah.
So there was no bias. There was no, they didn't speak the language. There was none of that.
No.
And these scientists that made this writing, that put this editorial in the Wall Street Journal in '94, they said the same thing. We have reliable tests that aren't culturally biased, that take into account, different literacy rates. And in the scientific community, this stuff is already accepted.
Yeah.
It's accepted as being valid, reliable. It's not pseudoscience. It's not magic.
It makes sense. Like when taking the test,